one of the things that I'm most excited to talk to you about, Krista, is this toxic positivity or the particular iteration of what's sometimes called therapy speak as a cultural phenomenon. And I'm curious how, like, what you see the contours of popular therapy speak as an ideology and how they differ from, let's say, the therapeutic process or, what actually goes on in the therapy room and sort of what is it as something outside of actual therapy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, hi Tara, hi everybody. It's really nice to see you guys. Thanks for coming to the salon. I'm thrilled to hear any questions that you have. Yeah, so sometimes when I do this work, I think some people get the thought that I'm anti-therapy, and so I want to go on record as saying that I'm not anti-therapy at all. So I've known many people in therapy. It's worked for lots of people. It's a great thing, and all in favor of destigmatizing sort of mental health stuff. What I do get worried about though is that I think there is a tendency in social life to pathologize any of our feelings that are not that you wouldn't classify as sort of like traditionally positive. And I think you see this even in a time where I think probably for a lot of people there is more openness about mental health and there is more frankness, and you have people writing public pieces, and you have memoirs and things like that, and you have a real move to try to get people more comfortable with the idea of talking about their mental health. You've probably heard the kind of refrain that people use sometimes, which is "it's okay to not be okay." So even though we live in a moment that I think you could describe as being a bit more welcome to mental health, I still think we have this tendency to think that anytime you're not feeling sort of your best, that qualifies as not okay. And so what I kind of want to do is sort of enter the conversation and ask the question, well, what is it that we mean when we say not okay? Like what exactly does that mean? And conversely, what does okay mean? I have the suspicion, maybe it's just a suspicion, but it's sort of my kind of like take on how things are, is that I think we tend to think that being okay means not feeling negativity, means not feeling anxiety, means not feeling fear, means not feeling anger, and that like the standard we use to measure is everything's great, right? Like thumbs up, doing great. And when we have those kinds of feelings, when we have feelings like anger and fear and anxiety and that sort of thing, we tend to think, oh no, things have gone wrong. And I guess what I want to ask is whether or not that's really true. Like, is it the case that something's gone wrong just because you're experiencing some kind of negative feelings? And of course, as you guys can probably imagine, given the title of my book, I think the answer to that is no. And I think we need to make some more space for sort of negative feelings kind of just in general, and say to ourselves, actually, maybe the fact that I'm feeling anger and fear and anxiety right now is okay. Like that is being okay, is to feel all of those things. But let me stop there and see if am I answering your question at all there?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I want to, so in your book, for those, which is great for those of you who haven't read it, something that I really enjoyed about it was not just the argument that you make, but the way in which you frame the kind of question of the role of the emotions, not just as a sort of therapeutic question within a self-help tradition, but within the sort of wider philosophical question of like, what do we do with our emotions? What makes us us, and what parts of ourselves are sort of things that are getting in the way of us versus really us versus distractions from us. And you talk about sort of different philosophical models or traditions for incorporating the emotions into human life, from the sort of the saints, and I'm forgetting the precise word terminology you use, but the idea that emotions need to be sort of gotten rid of, or a sort of different strain of wanting to channel them. And I'm wondering if you could give those viewers, those of you watching at home who are have not read your book, a bit of a breakdown of what those different
Yeah.
lineages look like and how they interact with one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think if you ask sort of the average person on the street, they might think that philosophy, like what do philosophers do? Do they talk about feelings? No, that's not something they do, right? They're the guys who are sort of like sitting in their quiet study, pondering over a book or something like that, right? If you do a Google search, image search for philosopher, most of the pages will be busts of dead people. So it's like there aren't any even living philosophers according to a Google image search, right? So this is I think people have this sort of vision of philosophy as, very in the clouds, very reason oriented, and we don't ever talk about feelings. And I think that that couldn't be further from the truth. So one of my hats that I wear is a historian of philosophy. So I love to go back and read. I lovingly call them my old dead guys, and think about and sort of interact with their views and try to understand their ideas and try to apply those ideas to everyday life as we live it today. And there's a really, really, really long history in philosophy of talking about emotions, especially from what I call a kind of like a practical perspective. So for most philosophers, questions about emotions are questions about how to live. So our emotional lives, I think they sort of recognize our emotional lives are, they're a natural part of us. We all feel things, but we also have questions about exactly how our feelings are supposed to fit into our lives, because sometimes they fit in really seamlessly and things go well, and then sometimes they don't fit in so seamlessly. And sometimes we feel certain ways we feel like we shouldn't, or sometimes you get hit. I know for those of you who have gone through, like, who've lost family members, for example, I bet you've had an experience where like grief comes in waves and then all of a sudden the grief hits and you're like, oh, this is not a good time for this right now,
Yeah.
and yet lo and behold, here it is. So our emotional lives are sort of part of us, but sometimes in sort of uncomfortable ways. And so the philosophers that I talk about in the book are people who are trying to answer this question. Well, like, how do I live with my emotions? What does that look like? What kind of attitude should I take toward them? What should I do with them? And you get a lot of different answers in the history of philosophy. There's at least one strand of philosophy that's going to say, listen, emotions, these things are trouble. They are always, they're these like irrational forces that take us over, and they are gonna just mess everything up. And we are way better off if we either try to get over them completely or we try to control them as best we possibly can. Because if we just let them run wild, who knows what's going to happen? Bad things. Then there's a strand of philosopher that's a little bit more welcoming to emotions and sort of says, well, I don't know. That doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem like they're always irrational. Like, aren't they valuable sometimes? Isn't it important for us to feel, like anger in certain circumstances? This, like, Aristotle is on this team, I think. I think Confucius is sort of on this team. Your first team are people like the Stoics. You might have heard, them. Those folks might be familiar to you. I think Gandhi is kind of on this team. I think Spinoza is kind of on that first team of like emotions are all trouble. But this sort of second team, the Confucius and Aristotle team, they're going to say, well, listen, actually, emotions can be really valuable. We just have to train them in the right kinds of ways. We have to manage them properly. So I like to joke that like Confucius and Aristotle were into emotional regulation before emotional regulation was cool. They sort of like had a sense of what that was supposed to look like. And then you have this like other group of philosophers who I would think of, like Nietzsche is on this team, and maybe like Thoreau might be on this team too, of folks who sort of think, I don't know, maybe it's not so great for us to have a real iron grip on our feelings. Maybe our feelings are actually really important in ways that we can't always project. And so thinking about managing them or thinking about controlling them is not really letting them have the kind of independence and the life of their own that they sort of need to play the important role that they have in our lives. And so like that's the team that I'm on in the book. And that's kind of the view that I try to defend.
So a curiosity that I have is, what is the relationship of feelings to kind of a moral architecture?
Mm-hmm.
Which is to say, I think it's very common in like contemporary therapy speak discourse to say like your emotions are valid, which often when it's boiled down to there's a version of it, at least in my sort of anecdotal experience, that sort of is dangerously like if you feel it, it's right, which
Mm-hmm.
seems to be a very intense claim. And then there's the sort of very weak version of the claim that's just like your emotions are valid, meaning you are indeed experiencing that emotion, and it's just
Right.
like a polite way of saying
Mm-hmm.
sure. and sort of there's something. So, but I'm curious, like, if we are to
Mm-hmm.
take the your emotions are valid, like extreme, strong version of that statement at face value, or at least
Mm-hmm.
say like that's where there's a cultural sense of heading. One of the sort of questions that remains is like, is there an emotion that it is immoral, maybe not to feel
Mm-hmm.
instinctively, but immoral not to manage? Or are there, how do we think about kind of what where we ought to attempt to change our emotions, if
Mm-hmm.
at all?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in the book I come down pretty hard on the sort of I'm not big on feelings policing.
Mhm.
So and I want to make it super clear that I want to separate out moments where there might be moments in your life where you feel a certain thing. Envy is going to be my favorite example because that's the one that I think most people feel. They're like, envy. I don't know. I mean, it's people I think are welcome. Oftentimes they're friendly to say, oh, it's like it's natural that you might feel it. But like that's the one that I think people tend to like judge themselves actually pretty harshly for, and they also judge other people for feeling envy. So like envy tends to be on the naughty list almost all the time. So that's usually the example that I go to. So there may be times in your life where like it is unwise and not a good thing for you to express your envy. Let's go there. And there might be times in your life where you feel it, but you're not really able to give your attention to it in that moment. And that's okay. So I don't want to say that those things don't happen. I'm sure that there's times when that's the case. Um, but I do want to say there's actually nothing wrong with feeling it.
Mhm.
And so I get that there's a lot of people who would be like, oh, time out, like that, like, isn't it be really bad? Aren't you like a bad person for feeling envy? So I want to tell you, no, you're not actually a bad person for feeling envy. And I think the reason we tend to think that we are bad people for feeling some of these negative feelings is in part because we don't understand them particularly well, and we don't quite know what they're for. So in the book I argue all of your emotions, all of them, positive, negative, doesn't matter. They're all ways of caring about things.
Mhm.
And that goes as much for your positive emotions as it does for your negative emotions. So what's envy then? To take the example, why do you envy people for things? Well, I think you envy people for things because you have a certain sort of vision for how you want your life to go, and when you see someone else enjoying something that you want for your life, it's a little hard for you to like feel positively toward that person because they have something that like you really want, right? So like my example in the book is like a classic car, let's say. Like imagine you've had this like favorite car that's a 1957 Cadillac DeVille is the 1957 Cadillac DeVille is the car that I use in the book. Um, imagine that's like you pinned posters of it to your wall when you were a kid and you like have pined for it your whole life, and then your neighbor rolls up in the 1957 Cadillac DeVille, and you're just like, oh, like consumed with this envy to see, this person sort of enjoying something that you've like longed for and yearned for your whole life. Yeah, I think because you care about that thing, you're gonna feel envy as a result. Like part of what it means to care is to be liable to a set of emotions, right? That's what it means to care about something. So it means you're gonna be like super happy when you see a Cadillac DeVille, but it's also gonna mean you're gonna be envious when you see somebody else enjoying something that you want for your life. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's all sorts of criticisms I think people want to make about that kind of stuff, but it usually takes the form of, well, but you shouldn't care that much about stuff. Okay, we can have that argument. Like maybe we can have an argument about whether or not people should care about stuff. Like maybe I shouldn't value cars. Maybe cars like really aren't valuable. Maybe I should value something else. But notice that's kind of a separate question actually. Like what you care about, whether or not you should value that thing, is a separate question from is it okay for you to feel envy when somebody else is enjoying it? So I think the criticisms that we often make of our negative emotions are usually actually about something else, or they're either about something else in the sense that, you're not supposed to be materialistic, and that's why we think envy is a problem, or they make assumptions about what the emotion is or does that I think don't always follow. Right. So, like, I think a lot of times people think in order for you to feel envy, like, it has to be the case that you either want to hurt the person who has the thing you want, or you want to like destroy the thing. right? So like I want to go like smash the headlights of the Cadillac DeVille, and that's like what envy means. Like what envy means is to have this like destructive urge, right? And I argue in the book that I just don't think that's true. I think people respond to their feelings in a huge variety of ways. And I think oftentimes what we're being critical of with our feelings is we're being critical of like how we manage them.
Mhm.
So I think most of the time, for example, like when people are critical of envy because it has that destructive urge, I think your destructive urge is actually like a way of coping with the feeling. So the reason people like start taking a baseball bat to the headlights of the DeVille is because it's like, well, if I can like wreck this thing and you don't have it anymore, well, then somehow that's going to make me feel better. Okay, well, you can think that that's irrational and like that's criticizable. That's fine, but that's not intrinsic to envy. That's just a way people tend to deal with envy. So my suspicion is that actually most of the criticisms that we make of our negative emotions are about the ways we tend to cope with them. And we cope with them in these kind of like not great ways, in part because we do not know how to just feel them. And if we actually knew how to do that, if we actually knew how to accept our negative emotions and live with them a little bit better, I think they would not actually be as destructive as sometimes they are, because most of that, those urges that come from them, I think are just ways that we've tried to like make ourselves deal with them or something like that.
Yeah, to sort of like turn feeling into action to get rid of the feeling.
Exactly.
So a curiosity I have is like, I think I think we're all agreed that no matter how envious you are, you don't smash the headlights of the car. Or like a sort of another version, like no matter how like lustful you feel, you don't sleep with like your sister's husband.
Right.
I think that's I'm sure there are philosophical
Mhm.
camps that don't agree, but I feel like this
Yeah.
is within a sort of. So a curiosity I have is like the between feeling and action,
Hmm.
the action of perpetuating a feeling or nursing a feeling versus
Hmm.
accepting it.
Hmm.
So like the example I would give is
Yeah.
like I have a crush. I don't know sister. I have a crush on my sister's husband,
Hmm.
and I feel like lustful towards him, and that's not great. I cheat with my sister's husband, but like the interim ground being like I think a lot about him and like
Hmm.
fantasize about him, or
Hmm.
I spend a lot of time nursing a grudge about someone I'm angry at.
Hmm.
Are there what is the distinction and what distinguishes a healthy or uh good if and you could even push back and say there is no good and bad in this. I'm open to that.
Hmm.
But the a desirable way of accepting one's feelings and an openness to one's own feelings that like perpetuates the like feeding the feeling.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think I'm still working my views out about this, but let me kind of pose a question that's like sort of a response, right? So have you ever noticed that we talk a lot about not dwelling in, feeding,
Mhm.
nursing, wallowing in? That's another word that people use a lot. We talk a lot about wallowing, nursing, and feeding negative emotions.
Mhm.
We almost never talk about wallowing, nursing, or feeding positive emotions.
Mhm.
So I guess what I want to ask is like, what's the difference there? So I think my guess is the difference is something like, well, positive emotions don't make you do bad stuff, but negative emotions do make you do bad stuff. Which I would want to say, well, like maybe, but sometimes people do actually bad stuff with their positive emotions. Like I don't know if you guys have ever known anybody who's sort of delusional in their kind of like positivity. Like I've definitely known people who are sort of delusional in their positivity and who will do things like if they have any kind of strife with a friend, we'll like immediately cut that person out of their lives, and then we'll say something like, oh no, I have to get rid of all of the toxicity in my life. You know what I mean? Like there's a weird kind of like hyper focus on positivity that will make some people just like avoid conflict or do weird stuff and not actually like interact with their friends or something like that because to like maintain the sense of positivity. So I would want to like raise the question, do our positive emotions always make us do good stuff? Like I'm not totally sure that's true. And then I think the suspicion is that because like our negative emotions are going to somehow like lead us to do a bad thing. and that if we nurse them or if we wallow in them, they're gonna do damage somehow. Now that maybe that damage is in action, or maybe that damage is like maybe psychological damage. Like again, particularly with nursing a grudge, I think people tend to think like, oh, well, if you do that, you're gonna like turn into an angry person, or the anger is gonna like eat you up from the inside. We have this real rhetoric around negative emotions as though they're like toxins, poisons, cancers. They're like rotting us somehow from the inside. But we never worry about this kind of like issue of possession when it comes to like demonic possession, like when it comes to positive feelings. Like nobody's ever like, oh my gosh, you have to manage your joy, be careful. If you don't manage your joy, it's going to eat you up from the inside. Or like if you do think that, people I guess think that's a great thing. Like if you get eaten up by joy from the inside or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, oh sorry, go ahead.
What I have a question here. So do you think that it's that we say minimize the negative emotions because it makes other people uncomfortable when you're in that space? And so we're like, no, I want you to be happy and positive and encourage those things. But when people get negative and sad and weird, they're like, I don't like this so much. Don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a lot of this has to do with other people's kind of responses to our emotional life. Like one of my favorite examples of this is like grief. I think some people, everybody is like, oh no, grief is natural. You've got to go through it. It's totally understandable. But I bet you might have known somebody who you felt like their grief is like going on too long, or they might be like they seem to be almost like grieving in an excessive way. And I think sometimes people kind of go like, ooh, like isn't it time for you to move on or something like that? But then I want you to like stop and think about that for a second. Is there some master list out there that says this is precisely how long and how much you should grieve for any human being who you've loved? See, I'm not ready to say like this is I think this is part of what's leading me right to the view of like I don't like to police, because I think there is I think we like if you press me and you say like, well, is there some timetable? I want to be like, no, there's not a timetable. And so yeah, I think you're right, Kaylee. I think a lot of it is people feel a kind of pressure to sort of go like, oh well, I'm more comfortable with you when you're positive and I'm not comfortable with you when you're negative.
Yes. One other question I had related to that. Sorry, I'm sorry. I'll try to go fast. But what about like in the context of a relationship where negative emotions, you're kind of holding on to them. It's a form of self-protection because you want to remember these bad experiences because your animal brain is like, I don't want this to continue happening. How are you supposed to eventually let those go? Because again, it's this thing of like, you shouldn't be holding on to these forever. You have to move on. You hear these things in therapy a lot.
Right.
What is your thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, and I know this might sound a little nuts, but I guess I just want to ask like what's with the push to move on? Like what's with the push to move on? And I think the push to move on is really coming from a kind of a standing assumption that people have that the negative emotions themselves are eventually going to like wear away at you or turn you into some kind of monster. And I don't want to deny, for example, that there are angry people out there in the world. I actually, though, don't think that they're angry people because they've felt a lot of anger. I think something else is going on with them that has made them an angry person. And it's not like, oh, I felt a lot of anger and that's how I've become an angry person. Anger is always, your negative emotions, I think, are always, they're part of how you care about stuff. And particularly for anger, I think it's one of the ways that we care about ourselves, actually. So like when I get angry at somebody for, insulting me or cutting me off in traffic or hurting me or something like that, it's an emotion of self-defense. So that says to me, the angry person feels like they constantly need to defend themselves. And then the question becomes, well, okay, but why? Like, why is that? So maybe there's something else going on with their sense of self such that they feel like anger always needs to be there in order to defend them. That might make them an angry person, but it's not as though I want to say like the order of operations is different, right? It's like, so you're an angry person because there's something's happening with yourself that's like requiring anger to kind of constantly be there, but you're not an angry person because you felt a lot of anger.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So my next question, and thanks so much for that, Kayla. That was incredibly, definitely very interesting road to go down. For all of you who do have questions, keep free. I think we all we will turn about 5:45 or 5:50 to more Q&A. If you have questions before that, maybe let's stick to keeping it in the chat from now on, just because I want to make sure that I get through my questions, but I'm very excited to hear from all of you. So keep asking, keep thinking, put them in the chat, put them in your brain for later as you choose. Christmas, my next question is then, what's the relationship of emotions to truth? And I think one of the sort of examples that come up again and again towards the end of your book, as you go through each sort of envy, anger, these negative emotions that we all sort of think we know, but don't perhaps know as well as we think we do. One thing comes clear that actually does seem to almost mirror what I imagine the best of the therapeutic process is, which is, what is actually going on here? What are you really mad about? And something that you point out is that many negative emotions are kind of, and I love the sort of Milton's Satan as the paradigmatic example of this, a desire to be recognized as mattering, or even to maybe to matter. Maybe that's a bolder claim. A desire to matter and a kind of self-love that, like, depending on the tradition you're coming from, philosophically, theologically, might be sort of a bad, sinful thing at the heart of it. It might just be the way of human beings. We have self-love and that's what we do and that's fine. It might be some kind of third or mixed thing that, I think you described very beautifully and movingly, like the desire to matter as something that is like an innate thing that humans have. And so I'm curious what the role of, if we have any responsibility to investigate our emotions, and whether there is a kind of truth behind them, such that, like, whether or not I am conscious of or aware of the fact that I'm angry because of X, or I'm envious because of Y, there is a fundamental truth to, like, actually what is going on is I'm a human being who has self-love, or I'm a human being who is upset in this way, or even in a circumstantial, like, I thought I was mad because I got cut off, or I was mad because this bartender was rude to me, but actually I'm mad because I feel powerless in my life in other ways. So do we have a duty to do we have a duty to investigate the truth of our emotions? And B, to what extent can we speak of a universal truth of emotions? Or is it only ever like getting to the situational, like, I feel this way because this happened in my childhood?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I'm definitely on team investigate, explore one's emotions. I think that's probably something we do actually very little, honestly. And I don't think we're like particularly encouraged to, especially when it comes to our negative emotions. I think we're much more encouraged to like get over, or minimize or dismiss or something like that, because you're not really supposed to, like, again, you're not supposed to dwell on them. So I'm very much in favor of, I would love it if it sounds corny, but I would love it if we could treat our negative emotions like a friend and sort of get to know them in the same way you would get to know a friend. Like, you don't get to know a friend by just like interviewing them. You know what I mean? Like, you get to know a friend by spending time with them and attending to them and thinking about like how they move in the world and what matters to them. And I think I would love it if we had the same kind of attitude toward our negative emotions. Yeah, so here's a kind of a funny thing about emotions. Philosophers do this a lot. So philosophers want to try to figure out like what is an emotion? Like, what is it? And we'll do a lot of things where we'll compare them to other stuff. So like, is an emotion kind of like a belief, or is it like a desire, or is it something else, right? We'll compare it to other features of our psychology. So some people want to compare emotions kind of like to perception. And so the example that I use in the book is like, your perceptions of the world can be mistaken. So if I look outside my window and I think I see a squirrel in the tree, but it turns out it's just a clump of leaves, okay, my perception is wrong. There's not a squirrel out there. Like, if I, rub my eyes and like look a little clearer, if I went outside and actually saw, then I could correct my perception. So sometimes emotions are like that. I'm walking in the woods and I get afraid because I think that there's a mountain lion. Turns out there's no mountain lion. It's just a weird shaped rock, right? Okay. So sometimes my emotions work that way. Sometimes they don't, though. So here's my favorite example. Roller coasters. My best friend from childhood loves roller coasters. She thinks they're amazing. I am terrified of roller coasters. I hate them. I dislike roller coasters for the exact same reasons she likes roller coasters. The speed, the height. I hate those things because of the speed and the height. So which one of us is right? Like, whose emotion is right? There's no answer to that question, right? It's about how you experience the thing. We're experiencing the same features because we've been on the same ride together. Like, we're experiencing the exact same features of the world, but we're responding to them emotionally in very different ways. So sometimes your emotions can be corrected, like perceptions, but sometimes they can't because there's no one way to experience the world. And sometimes your emotions are not about sort of seeing the world the right way. They're just about seeing the world the way you see the world. So, what does that then mean? It means it's a little hard to say, like, right off the top, whether your emotion is right or wrong. You have to go through the process, I think, of exploring it, trying to understand it, trying to figure out sort of what's going on, because just because it doesn't sort of like fit with how you thought, oh, this happens all the time. Sometimes you react to things in ways that are surprising to you. Like this happens all the time. Something happens in a meeting, and I have definitely had this experience before where, I was like super mad about something in a way that I totally didn't expect myself to be mad. I was like, why am I so angry about this? And I could have just said, oh, I'm blowing it out of proportion. I'm overreacting. But maybe I'm not, right? I mean, the problem is you don't know ahead of time, because just because your emotion doesn't sort of match the judgment that you have, or that it acts in a way that's unexpected, doesn't make it wrong and you right. So I'm borrowing an example from a philosopher who's written a great paper about this, about, what if you go to work every day and you cry on the way home and you're like irritable, and you are like, you snap at everybody at your job, and every night you go home and you're like, what's wrong with me? What's the matter? I don't understand what's going on. And then like it dawns on you maybe 3 weeks later, like, oh my God, I hate my job. It turns out I hate my job. I don't want to work here anymore. Notice that your feelings were sort of like alerting you to something that you eventually realized, but you didn't sort of see immediately. I think because they play that role in our lives, they help us discover things sometimes. Like, your feelings are sometimes right and you don't know it yet. And if that's true, we can't sort of always assume that just because our feelings are unexpected, that they're wrong. So that's where we've got to do that work of kind of exploring and examining and asking ourselves, why am I feeling this right now? Like, what's going on here?
So I want to switch gears a little bit. I could talk about this for, a million years, but so now that we've kind of got a sense of how one approach, like the approach that you believe is sort of the right one, or the best of the three, let's say, that you've presented to investigate our emotions, what is pop psychology doing wrong? Like, what is the the Instagram level, surface level, sort of mimetic meme version of this? What are they capturing that you think is right? Like, why is your emotions are valid? Like, girl, your emotions are valid. To what extent is that correct, and what extent is it wrong, and why?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There's so much like memification out there of feelings. Yeah, there is so here's one thing I think it's getting right. It's getting right the idea that, like, you don't have to immediately jump to a place of judgment with your emotions. Like, that seems to me, that's a good thing, I think. Like, it would be better if we didn't immediately jump to, dismissal, chastisement, whatever, like, immediately try to control. So I like that it tries to get people out of that judgmental posture. So I like that. I still think I have a little bit of a worry that people still think of your feelings as kind of like, the way I'm going to describe it is separate from you. So there's two things going on. One is, I think sometimes the way we talk about accepting our feelings is like accepting them as though they're just, I don't know, like synapses in the brain going off, or like I think you've heard this phrase, sometimes people use this phrase like your lizard brain. And it's like, oh, it's that part of you that's that kind of like primitive sort of part of you. That makes emotions seem really stupid, though, in some sense, right? They're purely instinctual. They're like just natural. They are like the product of evolution and kind of like nothing else. They are they're like really separate from you, whatever the like the self-reflective or conscious version of you. They're somehow really different from that. And I don't like the sort of fracturing I think that people are doing, where it's kind of pushing them off into this territory of mere instinct or mere like brainstem. That feels like not a great move, because it feels like it's not they're not it feels like they don't have messages to tell you, or they have nothing to say, which I think is not quite right. There was another thing I wanted to say about that, but I can't. My train of thought, he's derailed, and I can't remember what the other thing was. Maybe it'll come to me later.
We can go back to it.
Yeah.
So I guess my next question then is about the degree to it, like how do you see the sort of sacralization or the like magic manifesting positivity emotional crossover?
Yeah.
So I have a, like putting my cards on the table, one of my sort of particular interests is the history of New Thought. 19th century, for those of you who don't know, 19th century American, particularly self-help movement that was very much rooted in this idea that like if you focused hard enough and you wanted things badly, like the energy of the universe would conform to what you wanted. And there was a sort of pop science element of it, sort of caught up with ideas of, electricity and magnetism, and there was a spiritual element, but it was this kind of like Frankenstein science spiritual self-help phenomenon that has a legacy today in Norman Vincent Peale's Power of Positive Thinking.
Yeah.
Decades later, The Secret, Road to Burn. Decades after that, Manifesting, just to give all of you the background. So I guess one of the things that always strikes me as really interesting in these conversations is the way in which like new thought is that's neo thought new thought that's not
new thought yeah.
Contemporary iterations of new thought do operate on the assumption that there is a kind of that reality and our feelings exist in symbiosis to one another, with one another, that like the most extreme version is like if you want it badly enough, $1 million will appear in your bank account. But there's, I think, again, like less strong claims that, a less strong claim might be, if you walk into a meeting with a bunch of confidence, you're more likely to get money from a VC and you're more likely to become that millionaire, and so on and so forth. So I'm curious how we understand, particularly in this sort of post-manifesting age, apparently one poll, 50% of Americans believe it works.
Okay.
The difference between, it was only one poll and I like found it dubious, but that's what the only poll available on the subject. How do we, in 2024 in America, what's the relationship of our sense of reality and our emotions as something that like is reality something that our emotions can control? Is it something that we can't control, but we're responding to? Is it something kind of more complicated and back and forth? So comment on all of that.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It's amazing to me how many iterations there have been of new thought, right? It's really uncanny how it has this ability to constantly recreate itself, like constantly in so many different ways. And I like the cynical part of me is like, oh my gosh, this is kind of like, this is very much particular to the US, I feel like, and it is so, the US has like such a prize, a heavy prize placed on kind of positivity, and that's why it keeps getting purchased over and over again in all of these different ways. But I mean, I in my softer moments, I think, right, there is something, I think there's something helpful for people to sometimes hear what is the power of positivity other than just like, you know what? You can do it. You can do it. And sometimes you actually really do need to hear you can do it. I mean, like, that's not, I will 100% cop to being like having, like when somebody would tell me I can do it, like sometimes you really just do need to hear like I am capable of doing this thing. And sometimes that kind of like leap of faith in confidence in yourself is kind of all you need to sort of get you over the hump to do something that you feel like you're struggling to do. So like that's a totally normal, natural human thing. I think there's a real downside to sort of the power of positivity stuff. And it's not one that I think people intend when they think of this, when they kind of get wrapped up in this. I think they get wrapped up in it because everybody wants control. Life is very difficult. Life is going to blindside you with a million different things that you could never expect. Your life is not linear. It doesn't have this perfect progress arc narrative, and people don't know how to deal with that and would rather not. And so I think they just like desperately want control. And the power of positivity thing is a thing that gives you control in a world that feels like is not under your control and it feels out of control. And although that's totally understandable, I just don't think that's a good way to live your life, is to kind of like try to ignore the extent to which your life is shot through with a lot of luck, and it is something that you can't really control. But the kind of like unfortunate dark side of the power of positivity is that when bad things happen to people, is it because they just didn't believe hard enough? Like that seems like not a conclusion that you would want to draw. If that's your worldview, if your worldview really is, if you try hard enough and you think positively enough, and you like the prosperity gospel is this way, like if you just pray hard enough, then good things will happen. And so then like when something bad happens to somebody, is it because they didn't pray hard enough? Is it because they didn't manifest hard enough? Is it because they were too negative and therefore something bad happened? I mean, I take it that's most people who do manifesting, I think, don't think in those terms. I think they don't think that way. But if your worldview includes that move, right, the move between your thought and your positive outlook and good effects, then you got to think that it's also the same thing on the other side, which is like, well, if bad stuff happens, then you just didn't do a good enough job. And that makes it seem like people who really are subject to just bad luck, it's kind of their fault. And so that's just not, I just don't think that's how life is. I mean, I think people sometimes are just the subject of bad luck, and we shouldn't necessarily blame people for like not being positive enough, and like that's why bad things happen to them. That just doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems that there is this sort of tension between kind of control and a sort of recognition of lack of control that like plays its part in investigating negative emotions and plays its part in investigating like bad things happen to good people. And these seem, as you've kind of illustrated in your own work, like these are pretty fundamental questions in the history of philosophy. Like these are, it does, and what I really appreciated about your book in particular was precisely the way in which you kind of highlighted that like self-help questions are, maybe they're memeified, but they are philosophical questions. And it does seem like the most cohesive way to investigate them is like investigating in the light of the sort of bigger inquiry. At the same time, I guess the problem is like if in order to like I maybe I'm going on a limb here, but like if we really knew how best to approach our feelings, we kind of have to solve all the other problems of like what makes us human and why is there evil, and like
Yeah.
it does feel like a giant philosophical coordination problem to figure out how to be happy without at least having some kind of insight or opinion or like cohesive systematic worldview about the other stuff. At the same time, I feel like a self-help book that was like, do you want to be happy? Well, read the entire history of philosophy,
Right.
and fill in my view on metaphysics is this, and that does seem to be like a tall order. I'm not convinced it's the wrong. Like, I'm not convinced that a self-help book like that would be wrong. I don't know if it would sell. Maybe it would sell. Who knows? But yeah, it does. It does feel like these questions are all really intimately bound up with one another in a way that perhaps some of the more Instagram meme iterations of it allied. And it's one thing to say, uh, the experience of oneself having feelings as part of a kind of totality of being human, and it's sort of another thing to say like whatever you feel is true.
Right.
But I guess a curiosity that is how much of this is sort of the like an internet enabled ideology or actually being different, and how much of it is on the internet everything sounds a little dumb, and that's just
right.
like the result of anything filtered
Yeah.
through social media is going to be its stupidest version.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also I think and this is the internet enabled part. I mean, I do think there's a certain internet enabling of you know, and you see it in all kinds of places in like customization, right? And so everything is meant to be, your feed is customized for you, your advertisements are customized for you, everything is kind of like making you the nexus of the universe. And as somebody who's written about self-love, you would think like, oh, that's great, right? But there's a difference between sort of like thinking about yourself as mattering and thinking that like the world should actually quite literally be catered to you. My concern with some of the like emotional validation that happens as it takes place on kind of the internet is that it is it's actually more about you kind of talking yourself into doing what you wanted to do to start with. And so this is actually this is a bit tangential, but it's I have some criticisms of kind of the language of self-care. Because it's the language of self-care is a little bit like, first of all, it's like deeply consumer driven. So if you saw like the, you know, the therapy dupe hashtag and all that is like mostly about buying stuff. So okay, well, like that should be a clue that something's going on here. But a lot of the sort of self-care is like so much about I didn't want to make that phone call to the bank anyway, and so I'm gonna kind of talk myself into not doing it by saying, oh, but you know, I'm feeling a lot of anxiety today, and because my anxiety is valid, I'm not gonna make that phone call to the bank because I'm just gonna, and that's an act of self-care. So it's a weird version of therapy speak, because it's a weird version of translating your challenges with just sort of like everyday life into either like conquering it and feeling good about yourself because you called the bank, or like not calling the bank and then calling it self-care. Like there's a weird sort of I feel like there's a weird sort of uh begging off of like the typical normal stuff. Like, I'm sorry, but like regular old human life involves taking out the trash and loading the dishwasher. And that's like, that just is normal, regular old human life. And like, unfortunately, that's just how we all have to do it. We all have to kind of like get ourselves together and do the stuff that we need to do. You can gripe about it all day long. I mean, hey, I'm a person who loves griping. So like, if I have to take out the trash, trust me, I'm griping about it. But you know, I'm still going to do it. So I get a little concerned about the emotional validation. I feel like is tied to this kind of self-care thing, where it's just an opportunity to kind of like, it's another version of it's I am feeling like this is difficult for me, and so therefore I just want to not do it because it's difficult for me, or something like that, if that's making any sense.
It does make sense. You've also illustrated for me a tension that I don't think I've articulated in my own brain until this moment within the sort of contemporary self-care therapy speak discourse, which seems to be simultaneously too much responsibility and too little.
Yeah.
Like at often the same people, the same accounts will be posting like manifesting content where the subtext is like, you can control everything that happens to you by wanting it badly enough. But also there's often this like, I'm not really a moral agent. Like, these feelings are happening to me and I'm taking care of myself, and like, I'm not calling the bank. I'm not showing up for my friend. Like, I'm not holding space for my what have you. And I'm curious, like, is there just like, is it just oxymoronic and people are just posting memes and not really paying attention to what they're posting? Are these two sides of the same coin of a particular tendency? What is going on here?
That is a great question. This is, and I hate to say this because I don't want to sound like a Debbie Downer here, although I did write a book about negative emotions, so in some sense I'm like Captain Debbie Downer. But I just think lots of people are unhappy in a variety of ways, and that sometimes what you see in these Instagram feeds that post this exact same sort of like weird content that's in conflict with each other is you're seeing a person trying to work out how to get themselves into a better place. It's almost like it's weird. It's like your memes are your confession in some sense about what you're looking for in your life. Like the more and more feeds like this I see, I feel like it feels to me like I'm watching, especially my friends on Facebook in particular, like I feel like what I'm watching them do is try to work themselves into certain places, or it's telling me something about where they are with their own, mental health at this moment, that this is the kind of stuff that they're posting. It's like me being able to see their hopes, their fears, and that what we're actually doing is kind of using social media as a way of it's almost like talking to ourselves. It's talking to other people too, but it's a weird kind of, I'm trying to work out for myself what I want and what I hope and what I fear and what I dread. And what you're seeing in the conflict is, well, some days it's the things that are working out for me, and then some days it's the things that are not working out for me. But I think so much of it is, and I feel like this is also very gendered. I feel like women tend to do this way more than men. And that this is it's an interesting kind of, I don't know. I'm talking myself into this observation as I'm speaking out loud to you. But
That's
like,
what these salons are
I
for.
feel like I'm convincing myself that like you're like working out your own, your own concerns about your life through memes, through posting weird memes on Instagram.
Yeah, because I guess like one of the things about, and I am like very knee-jerk critical of Instagram memes. But this conversation is, I don't know, maybe in the other direction, saying like they are public in a sense. They are like attempts to communicate something to other people. They're not just like, we have memes in our head, but like what we're talking about when we talk about annoying memes is some kind of like attempt at communication. And maybe like the most charitable and generous reading of that is not that like the millennials and the Zoomers are narcissists, but rather that like there aren't a lot of like tools available to us more broadly to like ask these questions. And so we are kind of constantly trying to go back and forth, and like maybe once again the best self-help is a like philosophical inquiry. I don't know. I'm memeing myself into this during this conversation. But or like I think seeing this tension as a communicative act rather than just like here are some sort of ritualistic things that have any like interpersonal import. I'm aware that I have not opened it up to all of you, so I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to start taking questions first from the chat, and then if you would like to ask a question, feel free. After we've got one from Kaylee and one from Ariel, after that, either drop it in the chat or just hop on and ask. Either is good depending on your comfort level. But let's start with Kaylee Moore. So Kaylee's asked, how does this tie in with good/bad faith perspectives? Kaylee, you want to clarify anything about that question, or you just want to go in?
Yeah. So I think it was in relation, it was a minute ago. So I think it was in relation to the discussion around basically validating your emotions through like I'm not in control or I'm too in control. And so that made me think of the existentialists and how they talk about good faith versus bad faith. And so I guess my question is, where do you fall on this particular question as far as like, are we in control and do we have some agency over things like free will, or is it all just roll with the punches, see how today goes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there is a lot of bad faith in the kind of emotional validation stuff, especially if you are kind of, and I do think people, I'm not, I don't want to make it sound like I'm sort of like, oh, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like that's a little bit too harsh, or it's a little bit too strong, I guess I want to say. But I do think, and this is a weird relationship people develop, I think, to their emotions. I think I think a lot of times people will retreat into their emotions and they will convince themselves that they aren't the kinds of things that they have any kind of responsibility for or relationship to, that they are just things that happen to them. And they then sort of like take that view as a way of essentially not of usually of kind of giving emotional responsibility to somebody else. So what I mean by that is I think sometimes people will kind of retreat into their feelings, or they'll just act on them. And if another person, it's usually somebody they're in a relationship with, will say like, listen, hey, like, why did you have to react that way? Or why did you say that? Or like, why did you lash out at me? I think the retreat is like, well, I was angry, and anger is just a thing that happens to me. And therefore I'm not gonna have any kind of, I'm not going to take responsibility is like this is the wrong phrase. I want a different word than that. But I think people sometimes think they don't have to, they use the idea that emotions are these forces that just take them over as a way of not trying to understand them, as a way of not trying to develop a relationship with them. And ultimately frankly, like in the most bad faith way, an exercise of power over the person who is their loved one. Right. So forgive me, this is like me drawing on personal relationships of bad ex-boyfriends who like never felt any kind of like responsibility in any way to kind of like do anything with their emotional lives. And then like they would experience emotions and have no idea what to do with them. And so then they would just like act insane. And then I would sort of be like, why did you do that? And they would be like, I was just having feelings. And I was like, but those are your feelings and you can do things with them. You are not like, it's not my job to like manage you when you lose your mind about this. Yeah, I mean, so I think there is quite a bit of like bad faith with regard to our feelings, that we have a tendency. We do a lot of stuff with them and to them that I wish we would not do, because we just crank them through all kinds of weird machinations that I feel like we don't have to do that.
I just tried to turn off my mute, but I turned it on. Great. Ariel. Oh, that is not a question. Ariel, I just had a comment. She said something was well put. Thank you, Ariel.
I do kind of have a question.
Amazing, please.
On it. So that really stood out to me when you said, it's like too much responsibility and then too little responsibility at the same time, with like, I don't know, manifesting stuff on one end and then the self-care that kind of lets you off the hook on the other end. And I was just curious, has this like shown up in American society before? Is this new? And if it's new, curious as to why you think it is occurring. Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think the power of positivity stuff, the manifesting stuff, has shown up a bunch. Like that's sort of all over the place. I think there's also versions of the the sentimentalist tradition was sort of like the romantic tradition tended to be a bit like this, where there was a lot of your sort of emotional life was seen as, and like the richness and power of your emotional life was sort of seen as a sign of your intellectual depth and sensitivity. And I think it's like sometimes I think that's actually, there's a sort of a weird new version of romanticism. People will sometimes talk about performative outrage, especially online, right? And so in some ways, actually, it's just a new version of the sort of sentimentality of the romantics, where if I get on Facebook or Instagram, Facebook is for old people now, right? Is that right? That's what my students tell me. If people get on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or whatever and sort of like perform this kind of outrage at like whatever is the most recent sort of terrible event that's happening in the world, I think a lot of times people take that as a sign of someone's moral sensitivity or of their depth, or of the fact there's that old bumper sticker that says if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. So the idea is like if I sort of constantly perform outrage, then that shows you that I'm attentive, that it shows you that I'm intelligent, that it shows you that I'm morally sensitive or something like that. So but I feel like that those two things, right, that kind of like a lot of control over our emotions, or at the same time a lot of performativity or sentimentality. I think those two things do show up sort of over and over again in American society. I don't quite know why that's the case, but yeah, I think there are. I think you can see historical versions of that in the same way that you see the contemporary versions too.
Anyone else have questions they want to ask on the Zoom? Jenny and Mark, you raise your hands.
Hi.
Hi.
This is great. And thank you. Your questions are great too, Tara. I really appreciated this conversation. Yeah, I guess what I want to ask is I get the problem of under exploring emotions, and kind of, I guess where I'm at with that is kind of, I think it's good to ask, what does this emotion have to tell me about what I care about or my values? How do I want to act on it or not act on it? Is it, how can I make room for it, befriend it, like you're saying, so it's not like either controlling me or or avoiding it, whatever. But I guess what I wonder about the problem of, and I see this in a lot of types of therapy out there, of course, all therapy is the same, but is the kind of opposite problem of over exploring and over interpreting, as if you create a narrative of why this feeling is there, that is somehow in itself, that kind of insight is going to solve or healing something. And I get uncomfortable when often that interpretation is coming from the therapist as well. So it's like this out, and you can interpret things in so many different ways. And that could be a process where there's sort of no ending, no end goal, just that kind of endless exploration.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great question. And there's sort of like two different versions of this. One, you might think, and this is coming from actually one of my colleagues over at Swarthmore who does therapy with folks who have OCD. So one thing that he actually talks to his patients about occasionally is the idea that, like, actually maybe your feelings don't have any meaning. Maybe they aren't telling you something, because it isn't always the case that they are. So like my favorite example of this is like I've been teaching for, oh gosh, way over 15 years, like way over 15 years. And every single semester, every single year, for every single class, I get nervous before I go on the first day, right? I'm super nervous, like shaky nervous, like very, very nervous. And I could sit there and like explore it, and I've thought to myself, like, why do I feel nervous? Am I underprepared? Do I feel like I don't know what I want to say? Do I know where I'm going? Like, is the building a new building? Like, why am I sort of nervous about this? And it's happened so frequently that I've just decided there isn't any meaning to it. It's just the first day jitters, and that's what it is. And so I don't actually feel any pressure to get rid of those feelings just because they're there. I just recognize that, like, they're not actually telling me anything else, right? That's all there is to them, is just sort of the first day jitters. And that's okay. I think the move that people sometimes make is, if your feelings don't have a message, or if they don't have a purpose, then therefore you should stop feeling them. They're irrational. You need to get rid of them. That's the part I would just sort of want to resist and say, well, actually, no, like there's no reason for you to I don't have to do I don't need to coach myself out of my first day jitters. I just need to accept that there they are. They're my feelings. They're not really telling me anything, but that's okay. That's fine. So yeah, I think sometimes we need to take the weight off of our feelings and recognize that they may not be telling us anything. And that's all right. Just because they don't have a message right now doesn't actually mean there's anything wrong with them either. I think that's the worry that I think sometimes people have, is like, I worry that it's like, oh, well, if you don't have any reason to feel it, then you're not supposed to feel it at all. But to your other point too, there's that I don't know how about the therapeutic context, but absolutely one of the things we sort of do with our feelings, we do lots of things with them. And I think one of the things we tend to do with them is to write stories around them. And we write stories around who we are with them. We use them in a kind of like narrative story, right? So like one of the things, I think I use this example in the book, you have an obnoxious coworker, your obnoxious coworker corrects you in a meeting. It turns out he was right and you were wrong, but it made you mad and uncomfortable and you didn't like it. And then instead of just sort of saying, that made me mad and uncomfortable and I hated it, and like that was, and like, ugh, what a terrible experience that was. You start writing a story to yourself about how he's some kind of like, he's out to get me, or he's trying to ruin my career, or I'm going to tell a story about how he's like humiliating me and I'm his helpless victim, or something like that. And I think partly we do that narrative work with our feelings because we don't just want to feel them. Like, it kind of sucks to just feel mad and uncomfortable and made fun of. And so I'd much rather tell a story in which I'm the victim and my coworker is the evil villain, because that gives my feelings a kind of weight. It gives them a kind of meaning. And then I get to sort of like feel good about them and about the role that they're playing in this narrative I'm telling, rather than just kind of going, that was a sucky experience and I don't like it. Mm. But yeah, I think sometimes the weight needs to come off.
Yeah, thanks.
Kaylee, you have your hand up next.
Yes, so many questions. I'm sorry. My next question is kind of related to the sometimes you get really nervous, you have the jitters, you've experienced it, but it's not something you need to hold on to. It's kind of the flip side of that coin. So we have negative emotions, we have positive emotions. How do you make a judgment call on which ones to trust and lean into and kind of follow? Maybe you call it intuition, maybe you call it like a gut reaction to something. How do you approach the decision-making process around what next step to take? If you are the main character in your narrative-driven life, which we all are, how do you use those emotions to inform your experience moving forward into the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the thing is, and this is maybe this is because I don't know, is it because I'm a philosopher and I'm just kind of used to like a long timeline because philosophy is super old? Maybe that's why. I think it's not always immediate. I just think it's not something you can know quickly. I think you have to, which is why I'm such a huge fan of the sort of exploratory attitude. Exploration doesn't have a timestamp. It's not always, you don't always know if you go out like exploring an island, you don't always know how long it's going to take you to get the lay of the land. It might take you, it might be a small island and it might be kind of quick. It might be a huge island and it turns out you need multiple days. But I think our emotional lives are a little bit like exploring an island. Like sometimes it's a relatively, like you get to the end of it and you're like, oh, okay, this seems like what's going on. But then I think sometimes it takes a lot longer than that. And so it's not, that's why the exploration part is so key, because if you don't do that work, I think you can either sort of miss something or dismiss something too quickly, or and that's I think a real danger that people have. I think we're just kind of quick to kind of brush our emotions aside. But I just think there's no real way to know ahead of time before you actually do it, which is why that whole befriending thing is, I think, really important, because you got to get comfortable just letting them be in your life and letting them be in your head and just allowing them to sort of like be around for maybe longer than feels comfortable.
So the next person with their hand raised is Jaisal.
Hi, Jaisal. Thanks for coming.
Hey, Krista, it's good to see you. Good to see you. So I kind of have a two-part question. One is I was hoping you could speak to your book. In the conclusion. It kind of ends with Thoreau. So I wondered if you could speak about Thoreau, and then also kind of like branching off of that to use Thoreau as a bridge to another great Chinese philosophy, Taoism, and perhaps even with the Tao Te Ching. Are there any conclusions that you're drawing between those? I'd be curious to hear.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love Jaisal and I work with the Catholic Project together. If anybody knows anything about the Catholic Project, we're co-group leaders on many Chinese classics. That's what we like to read together. So Thoreau is I know he's like kind of unpopular these days. I feel like, I don't know, is that true? Maybe it's not true, but I feel like there's some circles where people are like, nah, Thoreau, his mom did his laundry for him and like nobody likes him anymore. But that's not me. I love Thoreau. The thing that I feel like Thoreau does well for me is to sort of show what an exploratory attitude looks like. In particular, a kind of a willingness to really encounter the wilderness. So that's what I love about the essays from Walden, particularly Higher Laws, where he's sort of like, one of the things, you can criticize Thoreau all day long, but one of the things Thoreau does really well is to try to kind of like understand the rhythms of the woods when he lives there and the rhythms of like Walden Pond. And when he writes about that, it's like unmatched writing, I think, because he really shows you this thing has a life of its own. And in order for you to understand that thing or even have some grasp of it, like you have to really encounter it on its own terms, rather than you trying to like fit it into some kind of preconceived notion of what you think it is. And some of that's going to require you letting go of a certain vision you have of yourself. And so like that's what I love about the essay from Higher Laws, where he sort of says like, I've discovered something about myself. Like I've discovered that there's this part of myself that he calls it this like primitive kind of savage, like forgive his language for this, but like this primitive sort of savage part of himself that equally exists alongside this part of himself that's drawn to these kind of like higher things, like more spiritual things. And what I love about that moment in the essay is that he says, and I reverence them both. Like I love them both. I don't love one more than the other, and I'm not going to denigrate it. But his kind of experience in Walden Pond, I think, is what gives him that self-knowledge that he has this like other part of himself. And so not only does he like learn the wilderness in Higher Laws, he learns himself with respect to it in some ways. He learns the wilderness within. And so one of the things I love about the Taoists, as JSL knows very well, is that they too have this kind of, and I think Zhuangzi is like very much, I mean, Dao De Jing is this way too, but like this insistence that you need to kind of stop trying to fit the world to your categories, and to really you have to open yourself, and you have to open yourself to the world's strangeness, to the world's unfamiliarity, to the world's like rushing in on you in a way that you cannot properly understand it or quite grasp it. And that's terrifying, I think. I mean, I'm importing a lot of stuff into like Zhuangzi, so maybe it's like not really there, but it's like exhilarating, but I think in some sense it's also kind of scary to really like face the vastness of the world. And that I think is another, I love that about them. Like I feel like that's something they have in common. That's something they have in common with Thoreau, is this kind of like, you have to open yourself up, and you have to do that in such a way that might be deeply uncomfortable, but that you'll sort of like discover anew sort of who you are in doing that, in kind of opening yourself up in that way. That's like, that was probably all too like abstract, and now I got to go home and read the Tao Te Ching for a reading group on Tuesday.
Good times. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Further questions?
Is there something in the chat?
No.
No. Okay.
All right. In which case, if we don't have questions, I'm going to do what you're not supposed to do at Q&A and invite comments.
Oh, here we go.
So I'm curious for those of you listening, especially if you are someone who has come across any of the sort of toxic positivity or sort of a lot of the self-care narratives we're coming across here. Talk about your emotions. Talk about your experiences.
Yeah. And also, if there's anything you guys want me to write about, like for Psychology Today, or if there's like a topic that you're like, gosh, I would really love somebody to write a piece on this. I am always looking for ideas, and I want to write things that are going to like speak to people. So if you have any thoughts about like, you're like, oh, I need it, I really wish somebody would talk about X, like, do tell.
Jenny and or Mark.
Hi. Yeah, kind of following up on what we were saying before, but I feel like this topic of emotions in psychology and in therapy is so interesting. One of my experiences was when I was quite young, got into something that was like emotional release work. So it was all about it. And when someone was asking earlier about like, are these ideas new, like the manifesting and the all of that stuff? And no, like when I was in my early 20s, I walked into this stuff, and it was this weird combination of like some manifestation stuff and some emotional release work, and just kind of a mishmash. And but I noticed that I think because so many people in our society are like kind of tend to brush their emotions to the side, maybe be emotionally cut off or not inquire into them, that I think the field of psychology or therapy often thinks that like, well, so that's what we need to get everybody to do, is like pay more attention to their emotions. And then like, I know for me, I was probably somebody, I don't want to say probably, was somebody who like, I feel a lot of emotions, and if anything needed to like at that age, especially like maybe back up and not let my emotions make my decisions. But often in therapy, it would be like, oh, this is so great. You're so open to your emotions. You're not pushing them down at all. And it was like emotions were telling us, not even like the example you gave, where something about the situation, but like you should let every minor situation like explode with emotion because every
Mm,
situation is a reliving of some earlier trigger. And I
mm.
joke about it now, like it got to the point where, like, if somebody didn't get the sandwich they ordered, it's like, feel as upset as you can be because it'll take you back to some, parental trauma or
Oh yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I'm not sure what my specific question is, but I think it has something to do with creating a therapy where feelings are one tool, but it's not an either or. It's not like either you make feelings like the bottom line of everything, or you push them to the side. But it's like, how can we integrate them? And yeah, they tell you something about your current situation, and sometimes it might be something a lot deeper, but other times it's not at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I think when we were talking earlier about sort of like the therapy speak and that kind of stuff, I think that, and this is no knock to psychology at all, but I do get a bit worried that if psychology is sort of the only place that we talk about emotions or something like that, or it's kind of like seen as like the dominant field where if you have any questions about your emotional life, like that's where you go. I get a little concerned that there's a way that that vocabulary is a bit restricted or can be a bit restricted. And so I would just love it if we could have a more expansive vocabulary around our emotions. And so that's one of the things I feel like philosophy is able to do. Like we're able to sort of say, hey, here's another way to talk about, to think about your emotional life that doesn't necessarily respond to or like map onto whatever the dominant kind of like trend is in psychology these days, right? Which I feel like there's, even though that can be a helpful vocabulary, it's also a bit of a limited vocabulary. And in particular, I think, especially with people who may not necessarily have had a lot of vocabulary or ability to kind of articulate their emotions. I don't actually know that. I mean, I'm thinking particularly, forgive me, I was not a teenage boy, but like I imagine I have known some teenage boys where like there's actually a lot of feeling. And the problem is there's not a lot of words to go with the feelings, or there's not a lot of like concepts, or there's not a lot of discussion. And I feel like encouraging someone who has lots of feelings but no way to talk about them to just feel more of them like doesn't strike me as maybe the greatest idea, right? It seems like it actually would be better to have give somebody more vocabulary to be able to talk about their emotions and explore them and think about them and reflect on them, where that isn't, it's not pushing them away or trying to control them, but it is kind of like thinking a bit more reflective, a bit more thinking, at least more vocabulary. I feel like maybe this is my particular view about philosophy, but I feel like one of the things philosophy does really well is to help people think through something complicated by giving them ways to articulate it. And having a way to articulate something can often be really, really helpful, especially if you have multiple ways of articulating something. And so if we can do that with regard to our emotions, I feel like philosophy would really be helping us out in some ways.
Yeah, that's great.
Oliver, you have a comment?
I do, although it could also be a question. So overall, I'm looking for some vocabulary or a perspective on some experiences that I've had. And specifically, I want to contextualize by saying that I feel like I've spent quite a bit of time and attention with my emotions, mostly through the pursuit of my spiritual practices. And during meditation, it's naturally the case, at least it was for me, that emotions start arising. And then with more attention and mindfulness, you start to see specific knots of tension in your body that have, along with it, emotions and narratives. And as I brought those sorts of practices to exercise, for example, cardio, yoga, weightlifting, I fall into a bit of a weird space where, as I'm exercising, those emotional releases are also happening, but it also feels a little bit like synthetic, right? Where for whatever reason, my mind has made those sorts of associations. And I've gotten into a weird space where I would just have random emotional releases at the gym, right? Like 2-3 times a week I'm doing curls. It's like, oh, I really feel like I want to cry with gratitude right now for some reason. So not quite a question, but do you have any vocabulary or perspectives to kind of contextualize what it is that is going on there?
That is super interesting, and I do not have I don't have anything particular to say about it, but that isn't it's an interesting, I feel like it's an interesting link that's been made between sort of a bodily experience and your emotional experience. And I guess I'm sort of curious about how that link kind of got made, maybe in the first place. And then thinking if you're sort of like disliking that link, I wonder if thinking through like how that link came to be might help you decouple, if it feels like that's what you would like to do, is to sort of like decouple these things. I just sort of wonder like how that link got formed to start with.
Yeah, I'm not so sure. And I don't know if there's a value judgment attached to it.
Yeah.
It came up because, Jenny was saying, like, is there over therapizing where we're kind of trying to interpret too much meaning into this? And me, it's like, oh, like, why is this even happening in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, I think there can be I think there's a lot of philosophers who actually want to attach emotions to the body in a really substantive way. Like they think of them as like deeply embodied. Sometimes they think of them as like deeply embodied experiences, which I think I would totally agree with that. But then I also think some of them want to say like they are like primarily bodily experiences. So this used to be William James, who Tara probably knows, with he was into New Thought for a little bit. Early in his career, he had a kind of like very bodily sort of theory of emotions. He ended up giving that up sort of later in his career, or at least changing it a bit. But there's lots of philosophers who just think like what it is to be angry is to like have, jaw tension or up, raise your blood pressure or something along those lines. I guess maybe it's not as though I don't think there are bodily manifestations of emotions, but I think it flattens their experience a bit to like sort of only think of them as bodily. And I think sometimes when we are in a therapeutic mode toward our emotions, I think sometimes people do kind of opt for a sort of a bodily picture of the emotions, in part as a method of sort of taking their sting away, right? Like it's not so much that there's all kinds of psychological weight resting on them, but it's like, oh no, this is about the bodily part of my feeling. And so if I can only associate it with the bodily experience of the emotion, then it takes whatever the sort of psychological weight off of it. It's just how my body feels. So I don't know if that's true in your case, but I'm wondering if there was a lot of concentration during your meditative practices on thinking of your emotions as kind of bodily experiences. I almost wonder if like now with the bodily experiences, like it's like, oh yeah, it is a bodily experience, and so since I'm having that, here comes the feeling, right? Maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, at the end of the day, wherever you place your attention, you're probably going to see whatever it is that you're looking for, right?
Yeah.
So we're coming close to the end of our time. So I would love to invite final thoughts, final reflections. Someone want to close us out with one question?
Yeah.
In which if no one comments, then I will comment. Something that I really enjoyed about this conversation is I probably sort of came at the thesis from a position of a little bit of like healthy suspicion. Like I think I'm probably inclined more towards like the channeling emotions. I mean, I have a sort of Christian theological sense of like the rightly ordered passions and their cultivation. And yet something that I think that I've kind of come around on in the course of this conversation is probably both the kind of the usefulness of honesty about one's emotions, like the degree to which like how do we find the therapeutic method at its best, as opposed to like internet therapy, as being like a kind of investigation that by virtue of not being an interrogation might allow for like a better and truer reflection of what's going on than like I'm having a bad feeling, can't think the thing. So that's something I've come around on, and I think I'm a little softer on people posting memes on cycle.
There we go.
or I'm seeing in that communicative act something that is less ideological than it is sort of good faith, if a little flaily, attempt to figure out like how do we, with the language available to us, ask certain questions that like philosophers have been asking in language that can translate.